Hey everybody, today for our topics we are going to be discussing most satisfying deaths in movies. I think there are quite a lot of them. Obviously this is going to be heavy spoilers, so I'm going to put the names of the movies below, just in case you haven't seen it, so that way you don't spoil it any further for yourself. But before we get into that, I'm going to plug my website as always. It is deepfocuslens.com. I am an artist and I do commissioned portraits, and I also sell prints of my work. If that is something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below, and if you have a question about a commissioned portrait or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below. Spock's death, of course. Spock's death in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. For me, it was a big culmination of his character and his journey from the original Star Trek series. The first Star Trek movie, and going into this film, especially his friendship with Kirk, the way it plays out with him sacrificing himself to save the Enterprise and her crew, the sheer emotion of Kirk and Spock's last scene as Spock is trapped behind the glass in the warp core, the two friends unable to even touch each other, his final words to Kirk, his passing, and then his funeral scene with Scotty playing Amazing Grace on his bagpipes. It may be a bit hokey by today's standards, especially Shatner's acting, but for me it still works as a satisfying yet heartbreaking loss, even though they decided to bring Spock back in the very next movie. Even so, that's what sticks out to me as one of the most satisfying, especially for a beloved fan favorite character of a sci-fi movie / TV franchise. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In terms of modern culture, that is one of the most famous deaths. And yeah, I would say very satisfying for sure. Wrath of Khan, is a great movie. I think I prefer aesthetically a lot of things about the original film, but I mean, in terms of story, oh God, the first one is just insufferably long and boring, and this one has a great story to it. It's a really satisfying one, and yes, I do find I love Next Generation. I prefer it to the original series, but I have to say, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to characters, for me, no question, Spock is the greatest character in all of Star Trek lore, and his relationship, I think, with Bones and with Shatner it's one of the best trios. I know they tried to go that route with Data, I think, the conflict between, being human and robot or whatever. Here he's like this half-breed struggling between his human side and being a Vulcan, and that's always just so interesting. And there were just so many stories where that point could be, a point of contention for the characters, and it could be, something to really expand on and bring a lot more depth to Star Trek than one might expect. And yeah, you do say it is hokey. It is. Like, the whole Amazing Grace thing is so 1980s, but it's charming. There's a lot of charm and a lot of personality, I think, to those kinds of films. Yeah, of course, The Amazing Grace is very dated today, and it is very cornball, but it's also very emotional. It feels emotionally earned to me. My dad is a huge Star Trek fan, and he cannot get through that without crying, seriously. And he told me the first time he saw the movie in theaters that he cried so hard that he couldn't even drive himself home. Like, he was that broken up about it, and I'm like, of course. For all of the flaws in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings adaptation, he did some things really well. I actually find it hard to choose between Gandalf's last stand against the Balrog and Boromir's sacrifice. I think the latter always hits me more because Gandalf is resurrected. Still, as the Fellowship exists, Moria and everything goes quiet as they grieve. It's a chef's kiss of a scene, as is Aragorn's farewell to Boromir, which never leaves my eyes dry. Yeah, I do agree. I think that the Boromir death is it's for me the most emotionally resonant death in all of Lord of the Rings by far, just because of, I think, where it's placed in the film. It's just very strategic. It's perfectly earned. It brings everything together. It's right when the Fellowship splits, and it gives Boromir a really nice arc, and he gets that redemptive arc, which is very necessary, I think. And it's just really beautifully done, kind of mixing in that whole platoon kind of haunting Defoe sort of imagery to it. I do find it to be very emotionally effective, and it feels very real. There's something very tangible about that moment. I find a lot of tangibility to exist in the original Fellowship movie, and then it starts to wane a little bit in the second one, and especially the third one I feel the most removed from it. But the Gandalf one is really good as well, but I think, I agree. It's because he is resurrected. It's not as powerful as the Boromir one. And also, Elijah Wood's reaction is a little bit over the top, but the rest of it is fantastic. The score afterwards, especially when they go out of Moria. I think that Orlando Bloom's face in that is really good. I don't know, he just kind of reflects a lot of the pain of maybe an elf that's not used to experiencing death. And it was subtle in the right way. So yeah, also a good one. All of the emotional moments, I truly believe, are in that first one. Looking through some of my favorites, maybe Stuntman Mike at the end of Death Proof. I think the whole movie builds to it in an amazing way. Also throwing the final scene of thirst in the ring. It's hilarious, dramatic, and yet somehow sad all at the same time. I love Death Proof, and I've talked about that. That's one of those movies that, is very underrated for Tarantino. I don't necessarily think it's that underrated. It feels very much like a cult type of film. But yeah, I do think by Tarantino standards, it is underrated. And, I do think you're saying it builds really well and in an amazing way. I think it's because it's very unexpected. It is very choppy and messy, and it feels very, grindhouse, which is what they're going for. But it's that subversion of suddenly this guy who's been in control, and he's kind of been this representation of the old school and of the voyeur, especially when it comes to the male gaze. And suddenly we're going to flip that on its side, and this guy is going to get the shit beat out of him. It is very, very satisfying. But yes, I love Stuntman Mike. I really, really do. And I just love Kurt Russell. I've been very honest about that. Give me Kurt Russell in a movie and I tend to go weak at the knees. I don't know why. It's just, I think he's got something really special and really charismatic, really charming, but also very genuine about him. Something very old school and dignified. And he's got just a great smile, very kind eyes. And he's very all-American, and he has a kind of masculine edge to him. And he can bring out the humor as well, especially in this movie. He can go from being so badass to awkward, there's some awkwardness in his character, to being whining and crying like a little girl. And it's incredibly funny. And that whole car chase sequence at the end is so fantastic because of just how much it gets subverted. It starts so where he is the one with the upper hand, and it really goes the other way so quickly. And as you say, it's mixed emotions at the end because, you want the ladies to get their revenge against this guy. Who's doing things for no reason, hurting people really for no reason other than his own, bitterness, his own complex. But at the same time, he is such a great character. You don't want him to die, But it's tonally very mixed. As I said, the humor's there. It's quirky. It's brutal. It's also sad. But, that's very, very classic Tarantino, and I love it. HAL 9000's death in 2001, A Space Odyssey. There's something so hypnotic about that scene, the foreboding red that engulfs you into the moment, and the harrowing sounds of Hal begging for his life, and that mundane robotic voice, and that industrial hissing sound in the background of the scene somehow reminds me of Eraserhead. Yeah, that's one of the most haunting scenes ever in Stanley Kubrick films, which is really saying something, let me tell you. And it's one of the more hypnotic sequences for me in 2001, A Space Odyssey, which is also saying something, let me tell you. And yes, I think what's so powerful about it is because, again, it's something where you're not expecting it. It's because Hal has this control, and he is so just dead, right? But as he starts to, disintegrate, I guess you could say, hearing that haunting voice, like singing the Daisy song, and hearing, just this computer slowly revert to like a child little by little, it's very, very disturbing. It reminds me of like Pierre LeFou in Cowboy Bebop or something like that. But yeah, I think it's the subversion of everything. It's because it is this intelligent, dead computer, and then suddenly it is reverting to a childlike mind, but it's so low and slowed down, just like in terms of the pitch of the voice and everything. So it's all very, very creepy, and it brings something ironically emotional to the scene, even though that might be a bit counterintuitive, I think. But I think that's important because then you go into the Beyond the Infinite sequence where everything is going to open up like a flower, I feel like, in terms of ideas. So I feel like, HAL 9000 and the end of that character going into that is one of the great masterful things in all of American movies. Hans Gruber's death in Die Hard, not much explanation needed. The music, the slow motion, and the oh shit face as he falls to his death. Alan Rickman is an iconic 80s villain in this beloved Christmas classic. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more to say, really. I love Die Hard so much, and I love it for a lot of reasons. I'm not one of those people that's like, only Hans Gruber all the time. But of course, Die Hard would never be what it is if it weren't for Alan Rickman's brilliant portrayal of that character. He's just, it's everything you could want in an 80s villain. It's over the top, but in a way that is very sophisticated, very Alan Rickman, very wicked and wonderful to watch. You can't take your eyes off of him. And that death, yes, it's really perfect because his character is so campy, and I don't know, like there's something very off about him, but yet so on. Like it's very weird to describe that character, but I think it's all reflected in that slow motion fall at the end, and it is, as you say, very iconic because he's just so theatrical as a presence. That's the only way he could die, like a big, like holy shit sort of face, like mid-colonoscopy face. Diane in Mulholland Drive, the way she's chased is frightening. The screaming is such a blitzkrieg. There's such an insane panic that you can feel in her. Then it's all over, and that billowing fog rolling up from under her bed, capping off everything you know she's been through. And then her spirit, or whatever that means to you, over the skyline, showing the innocence that was obliterated in Hollywood. It's so heartbreaking. It is so heartbreaking, and I think it might be one of the deaths that affected me the most in my adult life when it comes to like Hollywood movies, at least. And, especially when it comes to Lynch movies, and a lot of deaths in Lynch movies affect me quite deeply a lot of the time. And yeah, I think what's so powerful about it is because it's all this sort of subconscious journey. And so it's like we're watching a mind flicker out throughout a course of this movie. Just through the subconscious and filtering out all these ideas until we get to the cold, lonely, dark truth. And it's absolutely devastating because there's no escaping it. You plunge yourself in from the moment that the film starts right into this person's experience, right up into the moment that the life is over. And it's that connection with that slow kind of life flashing before the eyes experience that the movie is giving you that makes it just, to me, one of the most vulnerable things ever, even if the film is quite abstract in terms of the way it's presented to you. Somehow I still think there's a lot that is tangible about it, ironically. And yeah, it is very frightening because it feels so claustrophobic. And it is like, whatever it is, there are a lot of movies that try to capture nightmares and dreams and nightmares, and I feel like they often overshoot, and it's just the simplest things often that can be the most scary. And I feel like David Lynch has really figured that out. You just need some flashing lights and some old people coming at you and some ear-shattering screaming, and there you go. It does not take much. But, as you say here at the end, the fog rolling up from under the bed, capping off everything she's been through. Yes, absolutely to a degree, but then in a meta sort of context, I look at that as like, the smoke and mirrors, it's all over, curtains closed, that's the end of this, whatever this is, this artistic projection from the director's brain. So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but even so, it's an incredibly emotional thing. And Mulholland Drive is one of the more emotional films, I think, one of the most soul-bearing for David Lynch. The kid in the Austrian version of Funny Games of Michael Haneke. It's a bit cruel to say satisfying, but I was stuck to my screen. I think that's what you meant to say, I guess. I was stuck to my screen for 10 minutes. The way it was visualized was just perfect to me. The performance of the parents were something else. Oh yeah. Yeah. And I know what you mean. It does sound very cruel to say satisfying, but I know that's not what you mean. I think you mean it, in the context of the idea that Haneke is exploring here. And what's so great about it, I think, because I totally agree with you, it's an incredible death in terms of, from a filmmaking perspective. You don't see the death. You really don't see that much violence in the movie at all. It's all implied. But that death is taking place at the same time that, one of the killers is just making a sandwich very casually. And, all of that, of course, is, part of the symbolism, or I should say the satire of it. But yeah, no, I think it's incredible because, as you say, it's 10 minutes and the camera is just so still and so cold and so distant from these people. But it's not cold in the way that like Stanley Kubrick is. Like, it doesn't feel like it's studying the people as specimens in such a way. It just feels more like, I don't know, like to me, when I watched the movie, it felt more like, no, this family needs time to grieve. Or I should say this married couple needs their moment of absolute devastating grieving. They deserve it in this moment, just a quiet moment for those two, and we are not going to interfere. We're going to sit back from it. At least that's how I read it personally for me. But it is the performances. It's the performances by those two that are absolutely extraordinary. I mean, they give it everything. They pour everything you can imagine into those 10 minutes. It's very physical. It's just emotionally gut-wrenching like you can't imagine. And yes, trying to recreate that beat for beat in 10 minutes nearly in the remake just didn't work. There's something about those performances that do feel much more naturalistic, and I think the contrast between that and the villains in the film, which come from something very different, it's that juxtaposition that I find to be the key of why the original works and why the remake doesn't work for me. But I know I'm in the minority. It seems that a lot of people prefer the remake, which I don't know, I find that very surprising. But yeah, when I think of funny games, that's the scene I think about. It's the first thing that pops into my head is that moment in the living room and how powerful it is. Raoul Walsh's 1939 masterpiece, The Roaring Twenties. He used to be a big shot. The reason? It was satisfying and memorable conclusion that marked the end of Warner Brothers' gangster era that was so prominent during the 1930s. And it is fitting that it was bookended by the most recognizable face in the genre, Jimmy Cagney. I doubt many of your viewers have ever seen this film. Almost all of the comments are touching on modern films, but somebody needs to give some love to the golden age of filmmaking. Thank you so much, Andrew B. Really, really thank you so much. These are the movies I live for. These are the movies I know the most about. Seriously, very few people know who Jimmy Cagney is, unfortunately, but I've seen every movie he was ever in, particularly of that era. And I do think that you've really captured it. You know your stuff. The Roaring Twenties was kind of signaling the end of something. That was a huge year in movies, obviously, for Hollywood. There were a lot of groundbreaking things coming out of it. And the Roaring Twenties does feel almost like a fade. But, it really sticks the landing, but it does feel like, the end of an era. And, for me, there are a lot of gangster movies I really enjoy that star James Cagney in them. Roaring Twenties I like, but it's not as dynamic as, like, Public Enemy. I think the death in that is one of the great deaths of all the gangster movies, particularly of the 1930s. And also, the iconic death in Angels with Dirty Faces is a really, really great one that many people have debated over the years. I personally just find those more emotionally impactful. It just doesn't have that little extra something special that I think those earlier films did, but very good choice. But those are a few of the responses. So thank you guys for giving me some of those answers, and we'll do another one again shortly, I'm sure. But thank you guys for watching. Over here, you will see my patrons. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you are interested in becoming a patron, the link to support that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.